Hey, what's up, guys? Jake here. Gage isn't with me today. Gonna do something a little bit different. Instead of talking about politics, we're gonna talk about the economic outlook right now. We have the most recent economic reports out here for the month, and there's a lot of bad news and a little bit of good news. So, first and foremost, unemployment rate is sitting at a 4.9%, which we all know is nonsense. And we can tell it's nonsense when we look at the labor participation rate, sitting at 62.7%. And historically, how these two numbers run with each other, we can tell that there's not nearly as many people working as there should be related to that number. Also, along with the initial jobless claims being up 10,000, now at 272,000, it's not good. A little bit of good news. Continuing jobless claims are down, which might mean some people got some jobs, or it might mean people stopped filing unemployment benefits. Anyways, let's talk about how unemployment's actually measured. It's insane the way they measure this, if you guys weren't aware of it. Say you have a chemistry degree or an engineering degree and you can't find a job in your field, so you work part-time 10, 15 hours a week at some temp job for minimum wage. You're not counted. Even though I guess you're technically not unemployed, but underemployment isn't a real thing in the Bureau of Labor and Statistics report that they put out, which is insane. And actually, if you work a minimum of 1 hour per week and make more than $20, so let's say you mow your neighbor's lawn for $20 and they can record that somehow through some census they send you, you aren't counted as unemployed. So what I like to use Gallup's reports, which they take into consideration underemployment, and they use the data from the BLS. According to that report, real unemployment sitting around 9.9% right now, which is bad. According to the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average range between 1948 and this year was around 5.8%. But again, that's the government official 5.8. And they've changed how it's measured so many times throughout the years, who knows what that means in real terms. But it's not good. 9.9%, not good. Another number that Gallup uses, they call it the good jobs number, which is measured by 30 or more hours per week for an organization that provides a regular paycheck. And it's measured as a percentage of the population 18 and older, and it's sitting at 44.5% with a 1% margin of error, so it's not good at all. But good news, government payrolls declined 7,000, so government got a little bit smaller, which is always nice. Non-farm payrolls missed their forecast by about 40,000, no surprise there to anyone actually paying attention to the economy. Then we get to inflation, which is always fun. Inflation rate of 1.4%, which again just isn't true. The way they measure it, they measure the effects of inflation on the CPI, but not actual inflation. I mean, if you look at the increase of the money supply, it's insane. You look at CPI measures specifically consumer price inflation, which is not the only measure of inflation. There's asset price inflation, money supply inflation. There is no pure core, quote, inflation. It doesn't exist. And if we look at the increase of the money supply with the decreasing GDP, which we'll get into here shortly, it's going to be the majority of this recording, it necessitates that inflation is happening. You get into the concept of the velocity of money and how quickly monetary inflation turns into price inflation, but it's inevitable. It'll happen eventually. Just for a simple example to those who don't follow that, say I have an ounce of gold and I give out 5 notes saying they're worth a fifth of an ounce each, right? So you have this note, you own a fifth of what I have. I can't just make 5 more and say they're still worth a fifth of an ounce unless I get another ounce of gold. It's just there's not enough to go around. It might work out for a little while if all of the notes don't come back at once, but eventually I'm not going to have enough. And that's essentially how this money inflation works, or monetary supply inflation. But anyways, back to the economics. Personal spending was up about 0.5%, which the forecast was for about 0.3%, so it's up a little bit more than expected. Consumer credit increased 21.27 billion. The forecast was 16.8, so a huge spike compared to what people expected. So not only are we in a downward economy, but people don't seem to realize it, and they're spending more and taking out more credit, due partly, I assume, to the president's claim that our economy is just doing fine. Then we get into the fun stuff, which is what I really want to talk about. GDP is up 1.9% right now, annualized year over year from this quarter last year. So this is the third quarter in a row of decreasing GDP. And that's what I really want to talk about today, is what GDP is, how it's measured, and why it's a terrible indicator of how our economy is doing. because people don't seem to realize this. They just take it all for granted. So anyways, a little history. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. The modern measurements that they use for GDP was developed in the 30s, and the people that created it warned against using it as a measure of economic welfare, which is exactly what it's used for today. So prior to GDP, GNP, or Gross National Product, which now is known as Gross National Income, was used to measure economic welfare, and that takes into account all production from a country's citizens, whereas GDP measures production within the border, so within the United States. Even if it's from a foreign company and the money gets sent overseas, or the wealth generated gets sent overseas, it's still measured as GDP. Get into how GDP is actually calculated. There's a few different measures, a few different methods, I guess I should say. The one I see typically is called the expenditure method, which there's an equation for it. It's GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which in plain English, to those of you who, don't just want random letters thrown at you, it's the sum total of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So, consumer spending, consumption, obviously, investment in, businesses, in government bonds, in, the stock markets, real estate, whatever, government spending, and then all the things we export. So just think about that for a second. The more people spend, whether it's just pure consumption or not, whether it's on a credit card or with cash, the more you spend increases GDP. Same with government spending. It's the equivalent of saying the more credit card debt you're in, the better you are financially. It makes no sense. It's absolutely insane. And spending can be beneficial if it's put to proper use, but that isn't differentiated in GDP calculations. Bloomberg published an article a few years ago that said it beautifully. They said, which is better for a country's well-being? $10 million spent constructing a jail? $10 million spent producing a line of smartphones? $10 million clear-cutting a rainforest? Or a storm that requires $10 million in repairs? Because according to GDP and how it's calculated, they all get equal weight. $10 million on repair is equal to $10 million in building a school or creating a product. So, consumption drives GDP. And that's why you always hear people, especially people on the news, talking about how consumer spending is the engine that drives our economy, which is just absolute garbage. Consumption does not create growth. I've talked about it before. Frank Shostak, who's an economist, I think I pronounced that right, Shostak. Anyways, he's an economist and an author for the Mises Institute, said it really well. So he says, and this is going to be kind of a long quote, by focusing exclusively on final goods and services, the GDP framework lapses into a world of fantasy, wherein goods emerge because of people's desires. Because the supply of goods is taken for granted, this framework completely ignores the whole issue of the various stages of production that precede the emergence of the final good. The GDP framework gives the impression that it is not the activities of individuals that produce goods and services, but something else outside these activities called the economy. However, at no stage does the so-called economy have a life of its own, independent of individuals. The so-called economy is a metaphor. It doesn't exist. And people don't seem to realize that. It's the idea that desire creates things, demand creates things. Everyone talks about demand side versus supply side economics. People had demands forever. It's whether those demands can be met, whether there's a supply that can be created to meet those demands. And obviously someone can look at a demand that isn't being met and use that as a motive to create a product or service, but he still has to have that supply for the demand to be worth anything, for people to be willing to go out and spend money. A very smart man, a guy that I look up to a lot when it comes to economics and investing particularly, told me once to look at the market as a process. It's not a thing, it's not a market, it's a process. It's the sum total of all decisions made by the people participating in it. And that's exactly how you should look at the economy. There is no thing called the economy. It's the country's process. It's the process the people in the country take related to production and consumption. So Shostak goes on to say, the GDP framework cannot tell us whether final goods and services that were produced during a particular period of time are a reflection of real wealth expansion or a reflection of capital consumption. For instance, if a government embarks on the building of a pyramid which adds absolutely nothing to the well-being of individuals, the GDP framework will regard this as economic growth. In reality, however, the building of the pyramid will divert real funding from wealth-generating activities, thereby stifling the production of wealth. And that goes into the concept of malinvestment, misallocation of resources, which is my biggest criticism of all of these social programs that the government funds, all these subsidies. It's, yeah, sure, the money's going places that could help people, but there's a cost. It could be put to better use in other places. So, it's just a little something to think about. I've noticed not a lot of people understand what GDP really is. Most people don't study economics. It's not particularly interesting all of the time. So, if you add all of this up with that report I already did about the true nature of our country's debt, you can see we're in a lot more trouble than people, especially the president, like to admit. Just a little something to think about. Anyways, that's it for me right now. So I'll talk to you guys later.